The city councilman denied my zoning variance with a smirk, barely looking up from his notes. Your proposal doesn't align with my vision for this district. We're moving in a different direction. I'd waited 3 months for this hearing. My lawyer, David Chen, had handed the councilman a document across the table, and David's voice was calm when he said, "Actually, councilman, her property sits on the critical geographic junction for your entire proposed development. Your plan requires her written consent to proceed. You cannot build anything in that district without her approval." My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm 41 years old. And I own a small corner property in Denver that turned out to be worth infinitely more to a city councilman's ambitions than he ever wanted to admit. The property had belonged to my family for 40 years. My parents had bought it in 1980, when the neighborhood was nothing special, a mixed-use area with small shops, warehouses, and residential buildings. They'd opened a small family business there, a bodega and laundromat combination that had served the neighborhood for decades. When my father passed away 10 years ago, I'd inherited the property. The neighborhood was still modest. The commercial district hadn't changed much. There were no development plans. No one was particularly interested in our corner lot. I'd kept the business running, but it wasn't thriving. Foot traffic had declined. The building needed repairs. I'd been thinking about selling it to someone who might develop the property, maybe convert it to something more profitable than a bodega and laundromat. And then Kevin Hartwell became city councilman. Kevin Hartwell had run for city council on a platform of revitalization and urban renewal. He wanted to transform the older commercial districts into trendy, upscale neighborhoods with high-end restaurants, boutique shops, and luxury apartment complexes. He wanted to bring development money and private investment into areas that had been commercially neglected for years. On the surface, it sounded perfect. Revitalization. Economic growth. Opportunity. But what Kevin's plans actually meant, for people like me, was gentrification. Pure and simple. He wanted to push out the established businesses, the family operations, the immigrant-owned shops, the community institutions that had been serving the neighborhoods for decades. And he wanted to replace them with expensive establishments that would serve a more affluent demographic with more disposable income. And most importantly, he wanted to do it without paying fair market value to the longtime owners. He wanted them to sell cheap because they didn't understand their property's value. Or because they felt pressured by the city's zoning decisions. I'd learned about his proposal when a commercial real estate developer had approached me with an offer. I'd known immediately that it was below market value. Commercial properties of similar size and location in the area were selling for $350,000 or more. And that was without factoring in development potential. With a zoning variance, my property could be worth significantly more. I'd countered at $320,000, which was fair market value, but still not premium pricing. The developer had gone silent. No response. No further negotiation. Just silence. A week later, Kevin Hartwell's office had contacted me directly. I'd scheduled a meeting. Kevin had walked into the coffee shop where we scheduled our meeting like he owned not just the property, but the entire city. He'd been wearing an expensive suit and had carried himself with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. He'd been charming. Persuasive. He had the kind of charisma that politicians develop, the ability to make you feel like you're the most important person in the world while simultaneously making you feel like you should be grateful for his attention. "Elena," he'd said, shaking my hand firmly. "Thank you for meeting with me. I wanted to discuss your property directly, because I have a vision for this district, and I'd like your input." He'd spent the next 30 minutes explaining his vision. How the neighborhood was going to transform into one of Denver's most vibrant commercial and residential destinations. How property values would skyrocket. How I should be excited to be part of something historic. How I should feel fortunate that my property happened to be in an area he'd chosen for development. "Here's the thing," he'd said, leaning forward across the table with the kind of false intimacy that politicians specialize in. "Market prices are already at $350,000 for comparable properties," I'd said calmly. "And that's without any development premium. With the right zoning variance, this property could be worth significantly more." Kevin's expression had shifted. The carefully maintained charm had faded, revealing something colder underneath. "Well," he'd said, "that depends on zoning approval. And without the right zoning approval, without the city council voting to include your property in the unified commercial zone, your property is worth considerably less. Much less, actually. Because nobody's going to develop anything here if it's not properly zoned." I'd understood the implication immediately. He was threatening to withhold zoning approval unless I sold at a price he found acceptable. He was using his political authority as a weapon to force me into a bad deal. "I need to think about it," I'd said. "Don't think too long," Kevin had replied. "Opportunities have windows. This one might close." I'd hired David Chen, a real estate and zoning attorney, to review the situation. David had examined Kevin's development plan carefully. "This is interesting," David had said, spreading out blueprints on his desk. "His entire proposal depends on creating a unified commercial zone that spans 6 blocks. Look at the layout." He traced his finger along the map. "Your property sits right here," David had said, pointing to my corner lot. "This is the critical junction. For his plan to work, he needs to tie the entire district together. Your property is the keystone. Without it, his development plan falls apart. So he needs my approval," I'd said. "He needs your property included in the unified zoning," David had said. "Which means he needs your cooperation. And he's been trying to force you into selling it below market value by controlling the zoning approval process. Can he legally do that?" I'd asked. "No," David had said. "But he's hoping you won't realize what he's doing. The fact that you've hired an attorney suggests you do realize it." I'd applied for a zoning variance that would allow me to expand my business. It was legitimate. The neighborhood was mixed use. Small businesses operated there. My application was reasonable and consistent with existing land use. Kevin had denied it. And he'd smirked when he did it, like he was playing with a chess piece that he'd already captured. "Your proposal doesn't align with my vision for this district," he'd said in the public meeting. "We're moving in a different direction. Denial is recommended." The rest of the council had nodded along. I'd been furious. But David had been calm. "This is perfect," David had said after the meeting. "He just made a record of denying your legitimate variance request. Now we can prove he's using his authority as a weapon." "What do we do?" I'd asked. "We file an appeal," David had said. "But more importantly, we request that he recuse himself from any decisions related to your property, given his clear bias." The appeal hearing had been scheduled for 2 weeks later. But before that hearing happened, David had done something brilliant. He'd had a surveyor verify the exact boundaries and zoning implications of the development plan. And he discovered something that Kevin clearly hadn't anticipated. The development plan, as written, literally could not proceed without including my property. Not because of my business, but because of how the zoning infrastructure worked. The utilities, the road access, the traffic flow, all of it depended on my property being part of the unified zone. My property wasn't just valuable because I owned it. My property was essential because of geography. The appeal hearing had been held in the same city council chambers where Kevin had denied my variance request with that dismissive smirk. The room had been full: city council members, developers, community members, media representatives who'd gotten wind of the story. This time, though, David had prepared differently. He'd assembled a team of experts. The surveyor. The zoning analyst. He'd documented everything. When the hearing had opened, Kevin had tried to shut it down immediately. "This council already made a decision," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of his authority. "Reconsideration is not warranted." The vote was final. "Actually," David had said, standing up calmly and walking to the front of the council chambers, "Elena's attorney has new information that is absolutely relevant to this council's decision. Information that was not available at the previous hearing." David had walked directly up to the front table where Kevin was sitting. He'd been carrying an official document, thick, professional, with technical diagrams and legal analysis. "Councilman Hartwell," David had said, his voice professional and measured, neither hostile nor deferential, "your proposed commercial district development plan, as currently designed, requires specific zoning configurations. Elena Vasquez's property sits on the critical geographic and infrastructural junction for your entire plan. Your development cannot proceed, it literally cannot be built, without including her property in the unified commercial zone." David had placed the document on the table in front of Kevin. I could see Kevin's eyes scanning it, see the moment his expression shifted as he read what was written there. More specifically, David had continued, "The utility connections, the road access, the traffic flow infrastructure, all of it depends on incorporating her property into the development. You cannot build your district without her cooperation. And without her written consent to include her property, you cannot proceed at all." The room had gone absolutely silent. Kevin had stared at the document. I could see his jaw tightening. I could see the moment he fully understood what this meant. He'd been trying to bully a small property owner into selling cheap, not realizing that her property was not an obstacle to remove, it was an essential component of his entire plan. It was the keystone that made everything else possible. "That doesn't change anything," Kevin had said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "The zoning will proceed as planned." "Actually," David had said, "it changes everything. Elena's property cannot be forced into your zoning plan without her consent. And because you've already denied her legitimate variance request on what appears to be retaliatory grounds, any attempt to include her property without her approval would likely constitute a regulatory taking, a violation of her Fifth Amendment property rights. David had paused. More practically, David had continued, if you want to proceed with your development plan, you need Elena's permission. And if you want her permission, you need to offer her fair market value for her property. The other council members had exchanged looks. The city attorney, who was sitting in the corner, had suddenly looked very interested in his notes. Kevin had stood up. His face had been red. This council doesn't respond to blackmail, he'd said loudly. It's not blackmail, David had replied calmly. It's property rights. Her property. Her decision. The hearing had adjourned without a decision. But the math had suddenly changed completely. Kevin had his development plan. He had city council approval for the concept. He had developer money lined up. He had investors ready to go. But he couldn't execute any of it without my consent. 2 days later, Kevin's representatives had called David. They wanted to meet. The new offer was $420,000 for my property. That's fair market value, plus a development premium, David had said, reviewing the offer. He's willing to pay it now because he realizes he can't force you out. What if I ask for more? I'd asked. You could, David had said. But he might walk away. He has other options. Less convenient options, but options. The smart play is to take this offer, sell your property at a legitimate price, and let him proceed with his development. I'd thought about what Kevin had tried to do. I'd thought about how he'd tried to bully me into selling at a loss. I'd thought about how he'd smirked when he denied my application. Tell them I'll accept $420,000, I'd said. On one condition, Kevin Hartwell has to personally apologize for denying my variance request on retaliatory grounds. David had smiled. I'll see what I can do. The apology had happened in a private meeting, but Kevin's assistant had told me about it. Kevin had not enjoyed apologizing. But he'd done it. He'd said he'd been wrong. He'd said he'd reconsider zoning decisions on their merits, not on his personal preferences. The sale had closed 6 months later. I'd walked away with $420,000 for a property I'd been trying to sell for $320,000. And Kevin's development plan had moved forward. He'd gotten his unified commercial zone. He'd gotten his upscale restaurants and boutique shops. He'd gotten his revitalization. But he'd learned an important lesson in the process: power isn't just about authority. Sometimes it's about geography. Sometimes it's about owning the piece that makes everything else possible. I'm not in Denver anymore. I took the $420,000 from the property sale and invested it strategically. I bought a small commercial property in a different neighborhood, one that's more stable, with established businesses that have been serving the community for decades. Businesses with deep roots. Communities that aren't about to be gentrified. I invested the rest of the money and founded a consulting firm. But not just any consulting firm. I work specifically with small property owners who are navigating city politics and urban development pressures. I help them understand their property rights. I help them realize when their property is worth more than they've been offered by developers or manipulated by politicians. I help them understand leverage when they don't think they have any. I help them push back, strategically, legally, professionally, against councilmen and developers who think they can bully people into selling at below market value. It turns out that's become a surprisingly profitable business. Because there are a lot of small property owners out there who don't understand their own power. Who don't realize that their property might be essential to someone else's plan. Who don't know that they can demand fair value and get it. That's what I teach them. Kevin Hartwell is still a city councilman. His development plan was successful. The district has transformed. Property values have skyrocketed. He's become something of a celebrity in Denver's development community, the guy who revitalized an aging neighborhood. But I think he knows that his revitalization plan almost didn't happen. That it almost fell apart because of a single property owner who wouldn't back down. That he needed my consent more than I needed his approval. I think that probably bothers him sometimes. The thing I learned from all of this is that power in public policy and urban development isn't just about authority and position. It's not just about who holds elected office and who doesn't. It's not just about who has political connections and who doesn't. Sometimes, often, actually, the person with the least visible authority has more actual leverage than the city councilman. The small property owner. The family business operator. The person who understands that their property is essential, not incidental. Because geography doesn't care about politics. A critical junction is a critical junction. Essential infrastructure doesn't shift based on who's in office or what they want. Water doesn't flow uphill because a politician wills it. Traffic doesn't reroute itself to avoid a property owner's land. Kevin had tried to use his authority and position to force me into a bad deal. But my property's geographic reality was more powerful than his political authority. And once he understood that, he had to negotiate with me like an equal, not like someone he could bully into submission. That's the real victory. Not the money, though that was nice. Not the apology, though that felt good. The real victory was understanding that power can come from the most unexpected places. That small people can have big leverage. That sometimes the person who seems like they have nothing actually has everything the person in authority needs. That's the story nobody talks about in development politics. But it's the story that matters most.